On a humid afternoon in late October 1945, a transport convoy rolled through the gates of Camp Blanding in northern Florida, carrying 347 Japanese prisoners of war who had been captured across the Pacific Theater. Lieutenant Yoshiro Tanaka, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Army's 32nd Division, pressed his face against the truck's canvas covering. Trying to glimpse what awaited them in this strange land they had been taught was populated by devils. The barracks they could see through the palm trees looked larger and sturdier than anything they had inhabited during their entire military service. What Tanaka and his fellow prisoners didn't know was that they were about to experience a cultural shock so profound it would fundamentally alter their understanding of the conflict they had been fighting and the nation they had been told was weak and decadent. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the following months, these men would discover that what Americans considered substandard temporary housing for prisoners exceeded the living conditions of average Japanese citizens, and this revelation would force them to confront uncomfortable truths about the propaganda they had believed and the industrial capacity of the nation they had opposed. Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto had spent 2 years fighting in the Solomon Islands before his capture on Bougainville in March of 1945. During his training, instructors had shown him photographs allegedly depicting American poverty and urban decay, assuring him that the United States was a nation of haves and have-nots, where most people lived in squalor while a tiny elite hoarded wealth. As he stepped off the truck at Camp Blanding, these lessons echoed in his mind, and he expected to see conditions matching the stories of deprivation and hardship. Instead, what greeted him was a sprawling facility with neat rows of wooden barracks, each building equipped with electric lighting, running water, and raised wooden floors. The structures were painted white, with screened windows that could be opened for ventilation. Yamamoto stood motionless, certain there had been some mistake. Then he said to Corporal Hideki Sato, who stood beside him with an equally bewildered expression, that this could not possibly be where prisoners were housed. Sato, who had been captured on Saipan and spent several months in a Hawaiian facility before transfer to the mainland, replied quietly that he had seen the same thing in Hawaii, and that this was indeed how the Americans housed even their prisoners. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither man wanted to examine too closely. The processing began immediately. Captain James Morrison, the camp's assistant commandant, oversaw the intake with efficient professionalism. Through interpreters, he explained that the prisoners would be assigned to barracks, issued bedding and toiletries, and given a full medical examination. Private First Class Ichiro Nakamura, who had learned some English from missionary teachers in his childhood village, served as one of the interpreters. As he translated Morrison's words, he found himself stumbling over descriptions of amenities because the Japanese language he knew lacked ready equivalents for some of what was being described. When Morrison mentioned hot showers, Nakamura had to pause and explain the concept more fully to men who had never experienced such luxury. The barracks assignment revealed the first of many shocks. Each building housed 40 men in a space of approximately 2,000 square feet. Metal frame beds with cotton mattresses lined the walls, each prisoner receiving his own bed, a startling concept for men accustomed to sleeping on wooden platforms or thin mats laid directly on floors. Electric fans hung from the ceiling to combat Florida's oppressive heat and humidity. Tanaka walked the length of his assigned barracks in silence, running his hand along the smooth painted walls, pressing experimentally on the mattress of his designated bed. He had grown up in rural Hiroshima Prefecture, where his family of 7 shared a 2-room house with paper walls. The space Tanaka now occupied as a defeated prisoner exceeded anything he had known as a free man. That evening, the prisoners received their first meal in the camp mess hall. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who spoke Japanese, supervised the food service. The meal consisted of rice, pork, vegetables, bread, butter, milk, and coffee, with portions that seemed excessive to men who had been on reduced rations during the conflict's final months. Chen watched as the prisoners filed through the serving line, noting their expressions as servers loaded their metal trays with food. One young prisoner, barely 20 years old, stared at his full tray with tears streaming down his face. Through the interpreter, he asked if this was truly all for him. Chen assured him the entire portion was his alone, and there would be more if he wanted seconds. Yamamoto sat at a long wooden table with 11 other men from his former unit. None of them spoke as they ate, but their eyes communicated volumes. The rice was white and properly cooked, the vegetables fresh, the pork tender. Many had not tasted meat in months. The bread, soft and white, was a revelation to those unfamiliar with Western baking. After dinner, Corporal Sato leaned close to Yamamoto and whispered that he had heard this was not special treatment, but genuinely how the Americans fed prisoners every single day. Yamamoto replied that if this was true, then everything they had been told about American weakness had been a lie, and if the lies extended this far, how much else had been false? The following morning brought another revelation during the medical examinations. Dr. Harold Weinstein, a general practitioner from Newark who had been drafted into the Army Medical Corps, conducted thorough physical assessments of each prisoner with well-equipped facilities, including X-ray capabilities and dental care. Nakamura watched as Dr. Weinstein examined Tanaka. The physician noted multiple signs of malnutrition, untreated dental cavities, and poorly healed fractures in 2 fingers. When he asked about the fractures, Tanaka explained through Nakamura that he had broken them during training exercises 2 years earlier, but the unit medic had simply splintered them with bamboo and cloth. Dr. Weinstein shook his head and made notes. He said that they would address the dental issues over the coming weeks, ensure proper nutrition, and see if anything could be done about the fingers. Then he added that no American serviceman would have been left with untreated fractures like that, because it violated basic standards of military medical care. The comment hung in the examination room. Tanaka had considered his treatment normal, even generous, given wartime constraints. The realization that what he had accepted as adequate medical care fell far below enemy standards forced him to reconsider other assumptions about comparative military capability. Over the next weeks, the prisoners settled into a routine that continued to challenge their preconceptions. Wake-up was at 6 in the morning, followed by breakfast at 6:30. Work assignments began at 8, with prisoners engaged in agricultural labor on camp farms or maintenance duties. The work was not particularly strenuous, with 8-hour days and regular breaks. What struck many prisoners most forcefully was the casual abundance they observed everywhere. Yamamoto, assigned to maintain camp vehicles, found himself in the motor pool alongside American mechanics. He watched with fascination as they worked on trucks and jeeps, noting the ready availability of spare parts and tools. One afternoon, he observed a young American mechanic discard a wrench because the chrome plating had chipped slightly. Yamamoto retrieved it from the waste bin later and kept it hidden in his footlocker like a treasure. The tool was of higher quality than any he had seen in Japanese military service, yet here it was considered disposable due to a cosmetic flaw. Nakamura, whose language skills made him valuable as an interpreter, had extensive contact with American personnel. In early December, he was translating a discussion between Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Tanaka about arrangements for Christmas. Morrison explained that prisoners would receive special meals, additional recreational time, and packages from the Red Cross containing candy and cigarettes. Tanaka asked through Nakamura why the Americans would celebrate a religious holiday by giving gifts to enemy prisoners. Morrison seemed confused by the question. He replied that Christmas was about peace and goodwill, and that all human beings deserved basic dignity, regardless of political circumstances. The exchange troubled Nakamura deeply. He had been raised in a society that emphasized clear distinctions between in-groups and out-groups. The American casual extension of holiday generosity to defeated enemies seemed to violate proper order. The Christmas celebration itself proved to be another shock. The mess hall was decorated with pine boughs and a small tree. The meal featured roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, dinner rolls with butter, green beans, and pumpkin pie for dessert. The sheer abundance of a holiday meal exceeded anything the prisoners had experienced. After dinner, the camp chaplain offered a brief blessing and Christmas greeting translated into Japanese. He spoke about peace, reconciliation, and hope for a better future. Several prisoners, moved by the gesture, wept quietly. Corporal Sato spoke softly to Yamamoto, saying that his sister in Osaka would be struggling to find enough rice to feed her children, while here they were being served chicken and pie. The observation carried no bitterness, only exhausted bewilderment at the gulf between what they had been taught to expect and what they were experiencing. As winter turned to spring in 1946, prisoners began receiving letters from home, delayed by months of censorship. These letters brought devastating news. Japan's cities had been subjected to extensive bombing. Food was scarce. Families struggled without adult men to provide labor and income. Tanaka received a letter from his younger brother describing conditions in their village. The rice harvest had been poor. Their mother had sold family heirlooms to buy food on the black market. Their sister had moved to Hiroshima seeking factory work, but the city had been destroyed in August. She had survived, but suffered from a mysterious illness. Reading this letter in his barracks, surrounded by electric lights, lying on a cotton mattress with a full belly, Tanaka felt a complex mix of guilt and confusion. He was a prisoner, defeated and confined, yet his living conditions exceeded those of his free family in occupied Japan. The spring also brought new work assignments. A group of prisoners, including Yamamoto, was assigned to help construct additional facilities. This brought them into closer contact with American construction techniques and materials. The abundance of materials astonished them. Lumber arrived in huge trucks, more wood than they had seen in months. Nails came in large kegs, used freely without concern for conservation. Power tools, concrete, glass and roofing materials flowed steadily to the worksite. One afternoon, Yamamoto watched an American sergeant discard several perfectly good boards because they had been cut slightly too short for one purpose. Unable to restrain himself, Yamamoto asked through Nakamura why usable materials were being wasted. The sergeant, a carpenter from Michigan named Tom Harrison, shrugged. He said that ordering more lumber was easier than finding new uses for materials cut to wrong specifications. Besides, he added, the discarded lumber would likely be used for something else eventually. The explanation was logical by American standards, but alien to Yamamoto's experience. In Japanese military service, every nail had been precious. The idea that materials were so abundant that efficiency and time mattered more than conservation revealed an industrial capacity he was only beginning to comprehend. As summer arrived, the camp administration introduced recreational activities. A baseball diamond was constructed and equipment provided. A small library was established with Japanese language books. Educational classes were offered in English, mathematics, and vocational skills. Lieutenant Tanaka enrolled in English classes, taught by Corporal William Chen, a university student before the conflict. During one class, Chen distributed American magazines and newspapers for reading practice. Tanaka found himself looking at advertisements for household appliances, automobiles, and consumer goods. Chen assured the class that the advertisements reflected genuine American consumer culture, that ordinary American families truly did own refrigerators, washing machines, and automobiles. He explained that American industrial production had surged during the conflict and that the economy was now converting back to peacetime manufacturing. Tanaka struggled to process this information. He thought of his village, where perhaps 3 families owned bicycles, where electricity was still unreliable. If Chen spoke truthfully, then the disparity between American and Japanese living standards was catastrophic. That night, Tanaka lay awake and tried to reconcile everything he had learned. He had been taught that Americans were weak, corrupted by luxury. He had believed that Japanese martial spirit would overcome American material advantages. Now he understood that the material advantages had been so overwhelming that spirit had never mattered, that the conflict's outcome had been determined by industrial capacity before the first shot was fired. In late summer, a group of prisoners was taken on a supervised visit to nearby Jacksonville. The visit was controversial among camp administrators, but approved as an experiment in demonstrating democratic values. 30 prisoners, including Tanaka, Yamamoto, and Nakamura, boarded buses under guard for the 40-mile trip. Jacksonville in 1946 was a modest southern city, yet to the Japanese prisoners it appeared incomprehensibly wealthy. Paved streets stretched in every direction. Automobiles filled the roads. Not military vehicles, but private cars. Stores displayed goods in quantities that seemed wasteful. They passed residential neighborhoods where modest single-family homes housed individual families. Nakamura counted houses and tried to imagine a society wealthy enough that average working families could occupy entire structures. The buses stopped at a public park where prisoners were allowed to walk under guard supervision. Children played on swings. Families picnicked on the grass. A vendor sold ice cream from a cart. The scene was so peaceful, so divorced from years of conflict, that several prisoners stood frozen. Yamamoto approached the ice cream vendor, an elderly man who seemed unintimidated by former enemy soldiers. Through Nakamura's translation, Yamamoto asked if business was good. The vendor replied cheerfully that it was a fine day for ice cream. Then, with casual generosity that stunned the prisoners, he offered free ice cream cones to the Japanese visitors, saying everyone deserved a treat on a hot day. The gesture, so simple and human, affected Yamamoto profoundly. This elderly vendor, who probably had family members who had fought in the Pacific, felt secure enough and wealthy enough to give away his product to former enemies as basic hospitality. The casual confidence of that generosity spoke to a society fundamentally different from what Yamamoto had known. The return journey passed in near silence. Each prisoner was lost in thought, processing what they had witnessed. When they arrived back at camp, the barracks that had seemed impressive months earlier now appeared modest. Everything had shifted, recalibrated by direct observation of American civilian life. In September of 1946, rumors began circulating about repatriation. Japan had been occupied, and eventually prisoners would be returned home. The prospect brought mixed feelings. These men longed to see families, yet they understood they were returning to a devastated nation while leaving behind relative comfort. Nakamura received a letter from his mother describing conditions in their town. American occupation forces had arrived, bringing food aid and medical supplies. His mother wrote with bewilderment about American soldiers distributing chocolate to children, sharing rations with hungry civilians, helping repair damaged buildings. She could not understand why the conquerors were behaving with such generosity. He struggled to compose a reply. Finally, he wrote that the Americans seemed to believe in principles about human dignity that they applied even to enemies, that their wealth was so vast that generosity cost them little, and that their confidence allowed them to show kindness. Without fear, it would be seen as weakness. The first groups began departing for repatriation in late October 1946, exactly 1 year after Tanaka's arrival. He was not in this initial group, but he watched as former comrades packed their possessions and boarded buses for transport back to Japan. Among those departing was Corporal Sato. Before leaving, he approached Tanaka and spoke quietly, saying that he had been thinking about what they would tell people at home and whether anyone would believe them. Tanaka replied that he was not sure anyone should believe it because it seemed too strange to be credible. Yet it had all been real. Sato nodded, then added that he had decided to study English seriously when he returned to Japan, to read American books and newspapers, to try to understand these people who had defeated them so thoroughly yet treated them so decently. Tanaka's turn for repatriation came in January of 1947. He spent his final days reflecting on the transformation he had undergone. He had arrived as a defeated soldier, bitter and confused, clinging to beliefs about American weakness, even as evidence contradicted those beliefs. He was leaving as someone who had confronted uncomfortable truths about his nation's capabilities, relative to its chosen enemy. On his last evening, he walked through the camp, memorizing details. The electric lights that had seemed remarkable now felt normal. The solid barracks that had amazed him initially now appeared ordinary. The abundant meals, the medical care, the recreational facilities, all had become familiar. That familiarity was perhaps the most significant transformation. Captain Morrison conducted exit interviews with departing prisoners. When Tanaka's turn came, Morrison asked through an interpreter if he had been treated fairly. Tanaka confirmed that he had. Then Morrison asked if there was anything Tanaka wanted to say about his experience. Tanaka paused, considering carefully. Finally, he said that he had learned more in 16 months as a prisoner than in 2 years of military service about the true nature of the conflict. He had arrived believing Americans were weak and decadent, and he was leaving with the understanding that they were strong precisely because they valued individual welfare and built systems that served human needs. Morrison listened to the translation, nodded slowly, and said that he hoped Tanaka would carry that understanding back to Japan, because the world needed people who learned from experience rather than clinging to failed ideologies. Then he shook Tanaka's hand and sent him to join the others preparing for departure. The transport ship that carried Tanaka and 200 other former prisoners across the Pacific in late January 1947 was a far cry from the comfortable barracks they had left behind. Crowded conditions, limited food, and rough seas reminded them they were returning to a nation still struggling with defeat's aftermath. Yamamoto, who was on the same transport, spent much of the voyage in conversation with other prisoners. They discovered that those held at different American facilities reported remarkably similar treatment. The consistency suggested that what they had experienced was not exceptional kindness from individual commanders, but systematic policy reflecting American values. When the transport ship arrived in Yokohama in early February 1947, the prisoners saw for the first time the full extent of Japan's devastation. The port facilities bore obvious signs of damage and hasty repair. The city beyond showed vast areas of destruction. People in the streets looked thin and worn. The contrast with Jacksonville's peaceful normalcy could not have been more stark. Tanaka stood at the ship's rail, looking at his homeland with eyes educated by 16 months of American captivity, and felt profound sadness for what had been lost. Not just the physical destruction, but the wasted years, the squandered lives, the futile conflict that had accomplished nothing. Tanaka returned to his village in late February, finding his family's situation even more difficult than letters had suggested. His father had aged dramatically. His mother struggled with health problems. His siblings looked thin, despite the limited American aid beginning to flow into the country. The reunion was joyful but bittersweet. Tanaka tried to describe his experiences in Florida, but his family listened with polite incomprehension. When he mentioned details like electric fans in the barracks or abundant meat at meals, his younger brother laughed, thinking these were exaggerations. Eventually, Tanaka stopped trying to explain. The gap between what he had experienced and what his family could imagine was too wide to bridge with words. Instead, he focused on practical matters, finding work, contributing to survival, trying to rebuild a life in a transformed nation. Over the following months and years, Tanaka maintained occasional correspondence with other former prisoners from Camp Blanding. They shared the experience of being unable to convey to others what they had witnessed. Several, including Nakamura, pursued English language study seriously, recognizing that understanding America was essential for Japan's future. Yamamoto found work with an American construction company helping rebuild Japanese infrastructure. His experience with American construction techniques made him valuable, and he rose quickly. Working alongside American engineers, he saw again the casual efficiency and resource abundance that had struck him during captivity. In 1952, Tanaka encountered by chance a former camp guard visiting Japan as part of an educational exchange. The American, Robert Tucker, had been one of the guards at Camp Blanding and remembered Tanaka from the English classes. They spent an evening together talking about their experiences. Tucker explained that he had volunteered for prisoner guard duty because he opposed harsh treatment and wanted to ensure that American values of human dignity were upheld even in captivity. He saw the job as important precisely because it involved maintaining standards when dealing with enemies. Tanaka told Tucker about the profound impact his treatment as a prisoner had made, how it had forced him to reconsider fundamental assumptions. He explained that experiencing casual generosity from captors had been more devastating to his worldview than any battlefield defeat, because it demonstrated that everything he had been taught about the enemy was false. Tucker listened thoughtfully, then said something Tanaka never forgot. He observed that perhaps the most powerful weapon in any conflict was not military force, but the ability to demonstrate through consistent action that one's values and systems were genuinely superior, and that people would recognize that superiority when they experienced it directly. In the decades that followed, Tanaka built a successful career in international trade, leveraging his English skills and understanding of American business culture. He never forgot the 16 months he spent at Camp Blanding, the time when everything he believed about the world had been challenged and transformed. He spoke occasionally to students and researchers about his experiences, trying to convey what it had meant to discover that the enemy was not weak and decadent, but strong and decent. Many former prisoners carried similar memories and drew similar lessons. Some became advocates for democratic reform in Japan. Others pursued careers that built bridges between Japan and America. A few wrote memoirs or gave interviews, trying to preserve for future generations the strange experience of captivity that had been more comfortable than military service and more educational than any classroom. When Tanaka died in 1998 at the age of 77, his children found among his possessions a faded photograph of Camp Blanding's barracks, carefully preserved for more than half a century. On the back, in his precise handwriting, was a note explaining that this picture showed the place where he had learned the most important lessons of his life, where defeat had paradoxically offered education, and where the experience of captivity had provided greater freedom of thought than he had known as a supposedly free soldier. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.